Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second week of the OpenTrails Fall 2014 course. We are so glad that you're here with us today, and we have a couple new people who are joining us who weren't able to be here last week, so we're very excited to welcome you as well to the course. I hope everyone has been enjoying going over the materials and learning a little bit more about the OpenTrails specification. And if you are not yet on Slack, please let us know. We hope everyone is on Slack and able to communicate and participate during this course. So without further ado, we'll jump right into our slides for the day. Throughout the whole webinar today and in the future, feel free to write in Slack, communicate with each other. Jeremy, Alan, and Ryan are in there to answer your questions. And then towards the end, we'll also have a time for questions for that maybe I can answer or that they can answer as well. So this is week 2 of the OpenTrails course. We're super excited and thanks for joining us today. It's really great to have such an excited and engaged group of people who are working to convert their data to OpenTrails for publishing and sharing with our communities. Right now, if you're on Slack, please go ahead and say hi to everyone. Maybe if you're new to Slack or you haven't participated on the Slack channel yet, introduce yourself and where you're from. And maybe we can continue using that channel as a way to keep community together and get to know each other. So before we dive into today, let's do a quick recap of the goals that we set forth last week for the course and what we wanted to accomplish. First of all, we wanted to determine and understand the current status of your agency's data in preparing to publish in OpenTrails sustainably. Thanks so much to everyone who sent us your data already. We really appreciate it, and it's been really helpful in getting through this first step of trying to figure out what your current status might be. We said that we wanted to understand the OpenTrails specification, why it exists, and how your data can fit into it. I feel like we did a little bit of that last week as well. Number 3, and probably most importantly to you, we will help you convert your data to OpenTrails. By the end of this course, barring any unforeseen circumstances, we should either have an OpenTrails data set for you with you or understand what we need to do with the data in order to get to that point where we can convert to OpenTrails. Fourth, we said we wanted to determine procedures and mechanisms for maintaining, updating, stewarding, and sharing OpenTrails data. This includes, after we've converted, how do we make sure that people are using it? How do we make sure that the data is not getting stale and continuing to be maintained? And what can we do as proprietors and stewards and excited members of our agencies to make sure that that continues to happen over time? We also want to learn and understand what we can do with the data once it's in OpenTrails, learn about the different tools and processes and cool applications that we can take advantage of once we have the data in OpenTrails format. And finally, we said we wanted to work together to build an awesome community, share data and techniques, and give many high fives. This is still very important and is important in any data community, is to be able to share what works, what doesn't work, and how we have been able to succeed with the data standard. And that includes, what do we need to change about the community? What do we need to change about the data standard or the processes so that we can make it better for everyone who is looking to adopt it in the future? So far we've gotten through a couple of these things. This week we've been working through your data to try and understand the current status of your data to prepare for publishing in OpenTrails. And last week we worked to understand the OpenTrails specification. We went over why it existed. Alan gave a lovely brief history of why it existed and how it got to this point, and we now understand what is included in the specification and why. So today we are going to work on one particular goal, which is helping you to convert your data to OpenTrails. Specifically, we are going to walk through the conversion process and how we might go about it, and that's going to take up the bulk of today. And one of the other things that we might be able to get into is determining the procedures and mechanisms for maintaining, updating, stewarding, and sharing data. Hopefully we can get into that today as well. And then next week, in the last week of the course, we'll wrap up by learning and understanding a little bit more about what we can do with the data once it's in OpenTrails, and also how we can be members of the community in a way that's beneficial for everyone who has adopted OpenTrails, will adopt OpenTrails, and the agencies and individuals who are building tools to help display and manage the OpenTrails data that we're creating. That sound all right to everyone? I'm just going to assume yes, because I can't hear you. So we're going to go right on ahead into the wild world of converting your data for OpenTrails. A huge, huge, huge thanks to everyone who sent us their trail data. We got a majority of the agencies sent us data, which is really great. If you haven't yet sent us data, please send it as soon as you can, and let us know if you need any help with that. We've gotten a couple emails of people who are unsure if what they have is sufficient. Any data that you can send us is great. We want to see what you have, because then even if it's not quite at the point yet where we can convert it, we can still determine what you might want to or need to do in the next phase or period in order to get your data ready to be converted. So let us know if you need any help with that. Over the past week, for the folks who have sent it, we've been looking over your data, and we've been trying to determine what needs to be changed or added before we can convert to OpenTrails. And ultimately what we're answering, or what we're measuring against, the rubric we're measuring against, is making trail data OpenTrails ready. So what does that mean for data to be OpenTrails ready? Over the last week, we asked you to read over the OpenTrails specification, and having done that, you understand that there are certain fields that are required as part of the specification. That is what a specification is having a specific set of fields that are included. So for each agency's data, with regards to that specification and those required data sets and making data OpenTrails ready, we are looking to answer a few questions. It's more than a few. It actually ended up being about several. So firstly, does your data include both a trailheads data set and a trail segments data set? And how complete are those data sets? We are looking to see if you sent those data sets in shapefile format. A couple people have sent us file geodatabases, and a couple have sent Esri REST endpoints, and both of these are useful, but in terms of the actual converter, the data needs to be in shapefile format. We also are asking if each trail segment or trailhead has a unique ID field, and we'll get into this a little bit more in a little bit, but it's really important that every feature that we include in OpenTrails specification has a unique ID, specifically for data stewardship into the future, any changes you may have to make to your data, or if you want to connect other types of data. So we'll reiterate this a couple times because it's very important to hammer home the unique ID field is central to the specification being effective. We want to know if the naming convention for the unique ID field is consistent among the data sets. If one of them is using letters and one of them is using numbers, then that can be confusing and difficult for other data stewards if you're sharing your data for them to understand your conventions, and also if someone else in your own agency decides that they are going to start managing the data, for them to understand what that means and looks like. We asked if the fields have the required usage attributes as defined in the specification and if they're correctly formatted. And the usage attributes are actually not required. There's a little bit of a typo there. They are recommended, but to make a good OpenTrails data set and to be truly OpenTrails ready, we want your data to include as many of those usage fields as possible. So that's another thing that we're looking for. And we're looking to see if each trail segment and trailhead is associated with a single steward. As we mentioned last time, the point of OpenTrails data is to be of service to trailgoers, and it's really important for a trailgoer to understand of whom they should be asking questions and who they can go to if they have a problem. The idea being that that would increase the accessibility of trails and encourage people to go and learn more about them. So the association with a single steward is really important for each of those data sets. So we looked over the submitted data with those questions in mind, and based on our cursory assessment, most of you are almost ready to convert. It's really exciting to see that so many of you are managing your data in a way that will be compatible with the converter and moving into the OpenTrails specification. Of course, every data set is unique, and we are going to reach out to each agency individually this week to talk about what maybe needs to change or what we need, the few tasks we need to do before we can get the data converted. But most of you are almost ready, which is really super exciting, and I'm so glad to know that by the end of the course, I think we'll all be able to get to that point. It's awesome. So there are a couple common hurdles that people need to jump when of the folks who are in this course right now, and we need to clear those hurdles before we can convert our data. So instead of reaching out and talking about all of these things individually, which we will also do, we wanted to kind of go over them in a group setting because they seem to be common among all of the data sets. So keep in mind your agency will receive a personalized assessment and instructions for moving forward, and this is just a general overview. So this information you'll receive again specifically for your agency. So the first thing is that most of these data sets do not, that we've received, do not include trailhead data. Having a trailheads file is not something that we found is super duper common among park agencies, or it's called something different, or it's managed in a slightly different way. So the first hurdle we need to jump is collecting and maintaining accurate trailhead data. Trailheads, as Alan mentioned last week, are included in the OpenTrails specification because they serve as points of entry to the trail network. When considering and thinking about the purpose of the specification, we're trying to make trails accessible to trailgoers and get more people engaged with the outdoors, and so understanding where trailheads are is really important for that. And as you can see here, this is an outer spatial platform from Trailhead Labs, which we'll talk about more towards the end of this course, and more next week as well. But being able to understand the locations of access to a trail is really important and valuable for a trailgoer. Trailheads can also show amenities available at those locations, which is super helpful information if you want to know, is there a restroom there, is there water, that sort of thing. Those are the kinds of information that show up in the Trailheads file. So at this point, if you're not collecting trailhead data, if you don't have it, if you haven't been collecting it consistently, or if you have it but it's not really comprehensive, it's kind of strewn about, there are a few different ways that you can start to collect that data. One of them is with a really great tool called Trail Editor. A Trail Editor was made in Portland, Oregon during the National Day of Civic Hacking back in May. By the Code for Portland, by members of the Code for Portland Brigade. And Trail Editor is an editor for Trails. It is as it says there at the top, it is the easiest way to create trailheads. As Ryan, I see, is mentioning in Slack, folks can attach photos, attributes, and other information to trailheads. And as you can see here with Trail Editor, the way that the Trail Editor collects trailhead data is by actual trail goers in the park. So a trail goer will take a photo of a trailhead using a smartphone or other GPS-enabled device. And when you take a photo with a smartphone, it actually captures the location and elevation information of where that photo was taken. So now if we have a geographic coordinates, we can locate that photo in space. So you can email that photo to new@traileditor.org, and then the Trail Editor converts that photo to a data point with that photo attached to it. And then when you go onto traileditor.org, you can find other information, or you can find it there, and you can add other details and information to it, and then you can use that data to populate your trailheads data set. So it's kind of two birds with one stone, if you will. You can go ahead and get people excited about getting outside and being on your trails and sort of participating in this effort to help more people get excited about being outside, as well as developing your own data set. Traileditor.org is completely free and open source if anyone wants to contribute to it or use it. That is one way that you can generate trailhead data rather painlessly. I mentioned Outer Spatial, which is a tool for visualizing and hosting and maintaining OpenTrails data. One of the tools that Outer Spatial provides for you is that you can manually add and edit trailheads using their interface. If you head to outerspatial.com, we'll do this a little bit later in the course, but that is the second way that you can manage, edit, and maintain your trailheads data, is on outerspatial.com. And then thirdly, you can use more traditional methods. You can add trailheads to your GIS manually, going around and actually creating those points. You can also collect points with a GPS unit and then bring those into your GIS. So there's a lot of different options for creating trailhead data if you haven't created it before. And but as we've said, trailheads are super important for getting people actually onto the trail and making web maps of your parks and trails more exciting for users to engage with. Yep, I should probably, yeah. Trailhead data is very important for trail goers. The second thing that we've seen across data sets as far as hurdles go, we need to determine a system for giving each feature a unique ID that perpetuates across data sets. So the OpenTrails model is interconnected. Different data sets have to reference each other to understand how they relate. And having a unique ID for each feature is really super important for that. And perpetuate means that the ID will remain the same for the lifetime of the feature. And not only is this important for connected data sets, but it's also important in the future when you are changing data, updating features. That way you can always reference that individual feature and know that it's going to be that same feature. And it's also important if you want to add additional data, like using a tool like Outer Spatial, you can add maybe tweets and photos of that particular location tied to that trailhead or that trail. So this ID notion is extremely important. and it's a point we really want to hammer home, and you'll probably hear us say over and over again. And I think that just generally, if I can editorialize, I think that having unique IDs for features in GIS is really important. I mean, ArcGIS does it automatically for you. It creates an object ID because ArcGIS itself wants to be able to reference those individual features. So anytime you're managing data, it's important to think about how can we identify this particular feature in the future. So there's no canonical system for like a naming scheme for your unique IDs, but there is a suggested scheme in the OpenTrails specification, and that is the URL field from the steward in stewards.csv, and then the feature type, and then whatever the ID or the name of the the name of the individual feature. So what does that look like? That looks like countyparksdistrict.gov, which would be the steward URL, /stewards, which is the name of the data set, /0, which is the name of the steward. You know, for these other data sets, these are the same kind of idea. You start with the URL, then you add the name of the data set, and then you add the individual name of the feature. And that way, you know, you don't have a named trail that's ID is 5, and you also have a trailhead whose ID is 5, because then that gets confusing. So we want every feature to have a unique ID so we can reference it. And just at this point, to reiterate from last week, the OpenTrails specification is not super meant for internal data management. It's meant more to be a separate sort of branch off of your data that you can maintain and update consistently, specifically geared towards visitors and people who are interested in going on your trails. So having a unique naming or ID scheme for your OpenTrails data that is like separate or distinct from your internal management IDs, or the way that you relate data sets to each other internally, is totally okay. And kind of managing this externally of that internal management, it means that we can kind of experiment with it more and try and figure out what makes the most sense. So yeah, any change, and then, you know, in preparing our data for OpenTrails, which we're going to talk about for the rest of today, any changes that you need to make to your data can be done separately from your existing data workflow. So if I imagine for some of these data sets, you have multiple people who are managing them, using them, working on them. So you don't have to change things up for them in order to prepare your data for conversion to OpenTrails. You can do that in a separate place. And the third common thing that we noticed is that a lot of the trail use information was not necessarily in a format that was consumable by the OpenTrails converter. Every data set manages the trail usage information differently that we've seen. And as we'll see as we talk more about the converter can only take certain certain schemas and certain field names for those attributes. So yeah, before using the converter, we need to aggregate and reformat that data so that the converter can read it. And in the specification for trail segments, we have different fields for bike and horse and motor vehicles. Each of those has their own field as to whether or not that particular use is acceptable on certain trails. But some and a lot of data that is managed has a use field, and that use field has a list of uses that that trail allows. Fortunately, you don't have to separate your trail use fields out. The OpenTrails data converter can actually take a use field like this that is comma separated and can accept and transform that into OpenTrails once we put it through the converter. So as we talk about specific data sets and what we need to do to prepare them for the converter, this is something that can think about in terms of the relative ease of preparing data for OpenTrails. And please, throughout this, if you have questions, ask them in Slack, and I'll be sure to answer them towards the end. So information on how to make these specific changes that we're talking about is available in the OpenTrails guidebook, which you all read before this week. And if we haven't sent it yet, we will send you an assessment this week with specific changes that you might need to make to your agency's data prior to conversion, and some specific resources for making those changes. So all of the information we're going to go through today is available in other places that we will send to you with specific information about your agency's data. Just to familiarize you before we go through, before we send those emails, we're going to walk through the conversion process that you'll be undertaking this week. It is a little bit lengthy, but it's important because we want to make sure that our data conversion is going to work, and then we can have awesome OpenTrails data that we can send to applications and send to our users. This is the OpenTrails converter. Excuse me. It is a tool that was created by folks from Trailhead Labs and Code for America. It will convert the shapefiles that we are going to prepare into the 5 GeoJSON/CSV files that make up the OpenTrails standard. And we'll send you a link to this with our assessment of your data, so that when your data is ready, we can put it through the converter. There's also a validator as part of the OpenTrails tools, for which you can contribute your data and learn whether or not it actually meets the OpenTrails specification. As far as preparing your data for the OpenTrails converter, we have 2 different options on how to do it, and we will let you know which option is the best for your particular data. One option involves creating shapefiles, the other involves using a skeleton file geodatabase and loading your data in. I know we have a couple agencies that are not Esri users who are taking this course, and for those users, do not worry. You don't need to use ArcGIS in order to do this. However, all of our instructions are related to ArcGIS and Esri-related tools, because most trail stewards are using the Esri stack. And both of these options are outlined in the OpenTrails guidebook. The skeleton file geodatabase version is not quite updated in there yet, but will be by the end of today. And we'll suggest to you which is best for you to do based on your data. Ultimately, like as I've been trying to say, with both of these options, what we're doing is we're kind of massaging our existing data sets just enough that the converter knows how to make the OpenTrails GeoJSON and CSV files from it. It's not a matter of totally overhauling the data. It's just kind of getting it to the bare minimum point that the converter knows what to do with it. Just as a quick reminder, recap, there are 5 files in the OpenTrails dataset. And this is a model of how they all fit together. So we have our trail segments, stewards, named trails, trailheads, and areas. And all of these data sets are, as you can see with these arrows, all of these data sets are related to each other. The stewards.csv file is a list of organizations that serve as primary points of contact for inquiries about trails and trailheads inside of your system. Trail segments is a GeoJSON file that shows physical line segments of trails. And typically, multiple line segments will make up one single named trail. Named trails is a CSV file, and it contains a list of the named trails as defined by a parks agency, your agency. Fourth is the trailheads file, which we've talked a little bit about, which includes points of access for trailgoers and other attribute information associated with those points of access. And then the areas GeoJSON file shows parks and other protected lands. And I should note here, I'll mention it again, but currently the converter tool, from what I understand as of this morning when I played with it, does not convert areas. The converter is a work in progress, but areas is an optional file, so it's not something we need to worry about. And Jeremy, Alan, Ryan, be sure to correct me in Slack if I'm wrong, but that's what I understood. So the first preparation method that is available to you is converting your data to shapefiles and updating field names to a list of acceptable field names that can be mapped to GeoJSON attributes when in the output via the converter. The OpenTrails specification consists of 5 files, but the converter generates those 5 files from 3 inputs. So the first thing we give it is a trail segment shapefile, and from that file, the trail segments shapefile, the converter generates trail segments GeoJSON file, but also named trails and stewards. Based on the data in the trail segment shapefile, it can generate those 3 points, or those 3 data sets, excuse me. The trailhead shapefile just goes directly to creating a trailhead's GeoJSON file. And then there's the area shapefile, and that is highlighted right now in this image because the converter doesn't currently convert your areas to GeoJSON. There you go. The converter does not yet convert area files. In order for the converter to work its magic, the input files need to have a schema that the converter recognizes. And that can be, there's a lot of options available to you, so it's not extremely strict, but with computers and communicating with computers, we need to be very, very specific. Computers are not as intelligent about nuance as people are. So we need to be very specific with how we communicate with them. For each of the data sets that we generate with OpenTrails, there are some required fields and there are some optional fields. We're going to focus primarily on the required fields, but we'll also give guidance about how to generate the optional fields. The more of the optional fields that you provide, the more effective your OpenTrails data will be in serving your trailgoers. Those fields include things like the trail uses and amenities that exist at trailheads. The more of that information that people know, the more likely they are to take advantage of the trails in your area. So the first data set to prepare is the trail segments shapefile. And all of this information is in the OpenTrails guidebook. So from this file, the converter will create trail segments, GeoJSON, name trails, CSV, and then also the stewards CSV file. For your trail segments, there are only 2 required fields, and those are a unique ID and a trail name. Without these 2 fields, the converter will not work, and the conversion process will stop. So for each of these required fields, there is a list of acceptable field names. You'll notice that one of the acceptable field names, or 2 of the acceptable field names for a unique ID are object ID without an underscore and object ID with an underscore. Typically, you will already have this as an identifier in your data, so the idea is that we can use any of these field names and not have to do a ton of conversion. And then also the trail names that the segment is a part of. And those are the 2 required fields. So maybe stepping back for a second, maybe your ID field is not named any of those acceptable field names, or your trail names field is not labeled any of those acceptable field names. So we have to convert those fields to have a field name that is acceptable. And there's a specific process for doing that, which is outlined in the OpenTrails guidebook. After those required field names are adequate, then the next step is to add as many of the recommended fields as possible. And that includes appropriate uses of trail in the case of OpenTrails. And different agencies will store this data differently. Horses, and equestrian are all different ways that people will denote that a trail is acceptable for horseback riding, for example. So the converter will accept any of those field names. But maybe yours are different and you need to change it so that it's one of these acceptable field names. And as we mentioned before, if you have one single use column and you don't have separate fields for hiking, bicycling, horseback riding, and so on, that's okay, and the converter can handle that so long as the uses are comma separated inside of that use field. It's possible also, and probably likely because most of us keep data for internal management, that your data has additional attributes beyond those required of the OpenTrails specification. When we convert our data, the converter will actually ignore and remove them. The resulting GeoJSON file will not include, for example, the name of the last person to edit the file, or the open hours, which are not data, or not pieces of data that the OpenTrails specification asks for. So keep that in mind before you are converting your data. So once we've converted the trail segments shapefile, internally the converter has actually generated 3 files, right? It's generated the trail segments GeoJSON, the stewards.csv, and the named trails.csv. So the second data set you need to prepare is the trailheads shapefile, which will make the trailheads GeoJSON file. Similar to trail segments, trailheads has 2 required fields, a unique ID and a name. This is pretty common. To note, a unique identifier is not explicitly required by the converter. If you don't have a unique ID for your trailheads, the converter will generate one for you. But as we've mentioned a couple times now, having a scheme for naming unique IDs across data sets is going to become really important as time goes on in terms of managing, updating, and attaching more information to that data. So while the converter will assign an ID to your trailheads, we highly recommend that you define that explicitly for yourself with your data. Yes. Once those 2 shapefiles are prepared for the converter, what you have to do is create a relationship between the 2 data sets so that the trail, and this is done via a spatial process inside of ArcGIS that is defined in the OpenTrails guidebook. And the idea there is that it does a spatial query to determine what trails are within a certain proximity of the, or excuse me, yeah, what trails are in a certain proximity of that trailhead, and then creates a connection between those so that there is an ID field that's shared between them. And this is great because it enables other functionality with your data that applications like Outer Spatial can take advantage of in terms of creating products and cool, interesting maps and applications and so on for your trail goers. So all of that is defined in the OpenTrails guidebook. I won't go it step by step, but ultimately you're taking the unique IDs of the trail segments and adding them to a new field in the trailheads file so that each trailhead has an understanding of which trail segment IDs are associated with it, aka are proximal to it spatially. And this is what it looks like after you've done that connection. This is a screenshot of an attribute table in ArcGIS, and you'll see that there's a field named segment IDs, and each of those segment IDs relates to a specific trail segment that for that particular trailhead that it's close to. Yeah, and the detailed instructions on how to do that are in the OpenTrails guidebook. Once you've made that connection, the last thing that we need to do is to add recommended fields to the trailhead shapefile. It has a name, it has an ID, but there's also other recommended fields for the trailheads, and those include street address, whether or not there's parking, whether there's drinking water, restrooms, and information or info kiosk at the trailhead. And none of these are required, of course, as we mentioned, but they're all extremely useful when creating trail data. Boom! Once you've done all that, then you're ready for the converter. And it seems like a little bit of a long process of having to redefine field names and so on, but in doing so, it makes the rest of the process go extremely smoothly. The other method that I mentioned before uses a skeleton geodatabase, file geodatabase, to load data into a predetermined converter compatible schema. So we have some empty feature classes that have all of the correct attribute fields, and you can do dynamic field mapping using our catalog into it. And this option is for data sets with schemas that are pretty close to compatible. Occasionally you'll have, maybe there's a usage field, or several usage fields that need to be concatenated into one field in order to be OpenTrails compatible. In that case, you probably would not want to use this method. But for data sets that are pretty close to being compatible, this is a great way to go so that you don't have to manually add and remove fields to rename them. And we'll let you know when we send you information back with an assessment of your data whether this option is best for you or not. It's really going to depend on your specific data. And although that is not currently in the OpenTrails guidebook, that particular method, by the end of today or tomorrow, that information will be added with a step-by-step walkthrough of how you would do that. So either way you choose to go, you end up with these shape files, a trailhead shape file and a trail segments shape file. And once you have those two, then you're ready to, that are in the correct schema that the converter can interpret, then you can start to feed it through the converter. And this is what the converter looks like when we start to get into it. It takes a zip shape file for the trail segments, and it actually walks you through step by step what you need to add at what point. And each of the steps builds upon the step before it to create your completed OpenTrails data set, which you receive in a zip file. So once you have added your segments shapefile, it lets you review the data that you uploaded, see whether or not it was correct, and then when you feel good about it, you can convert it. But if for some reason it turns out that you have misspelled a field name or something wasn't included, the converter will tell you that it can't continue forward with the process because it still needs some additional information from your shapefile that you haven't contributed. And so it's really nice that the converter doesn't just provide you with a broken data set. It actually gives you some guidance about what you need to change. And so the reason we're doing so much preparation for the converter is to avoid situations like that. If we can kind of get it all ready to go up front, we don't have to do experimentation while actually going through the converter. We can kind of know what sort of schema the converter likes before we go ahead and try to use it. If we're successful and we have all the required field names for those files, then the converter will deliver us an OpenTrails zip file that contains the 5 OpenTrails files that have been generated from the 2 shapefiles we input. If you don't input any areas data, which at this point I don't think it would even work, but it will generate an empty areas.geojson file, which you can add to manually using a tool called geojson.io, which is also outlined in the OpenTrails guidebook. So the resulting files will look something like this. The trailheads.geojson file is a GeoJSON file. It is a text file feature collection that has each of the individual trailhead features with yes and no keys and values for the different information that you've provided in the shapefile. The stewards.csv is a comma-separated file, or you can view it in a spreadsheet viewer, Google Sheets, or Excel, and it contains all of the information that was asked of us and provided. Named trails is also a CSV that includes the data that we provided to it. And you'll notice that it also includes segment IDs, which is what we created when doing that spatial query between the, oh, no, that's not true. Never mind. The segment IDs were what segments are part of that particular named trail, and that's generated by the converter. Sorry about that. And then the trail segments GeoJSON, again, is very similar to the trailheads GeoJSON, and it has the information that is asked for. So that's great. At that point, we have OpenTrails data in a zipped OpenTrails file, and maybe it sounds complicated, maybe it doesn't, but if you can kind of follow the steps as you walk through it and get it into the converter, then it sort of does the converter does a lot of the work for you. The most challenging part happens internally in your agency, trying to figure out how you're going to manage and steward data so that it will continue to have the information that is required to make a good OpenTrails zip file. And we'll talk more about this next week when we talk about what you can do with OpenTrails data. But you can visualize your OpenTrails data really quickly and easily with a tool called OuterSpatial. If you go to outerspatial.com, you can upload the OpenTrails zip file that is provided by the converter. OuterSpatial automatically shows your trails and trailheads on a map. This is the Sugar Land, Texas. Just by adding the OpenTrails data, you can end up with trails and trailheads. So with the overview that we just did and some guidance from us via email, you'll be able to spend this next week actually converting your data. And once you start to go through this conversion process, you'll kind of start to see where your data is lacking, where you might want to start managing it differently internally or collecting it differently. And it's possible that that will extend even beyond our assessment of your data. You may realize through going through the process that there's something that you didn't include that you really wanted to, or something of that ilk. So yes, definitely look out for an email from us about your data before the end of the week. We will get to you. If you have sent us your data at this point, we'll definitely get to you by the end of the week with an assessment and some guidance about how to move forward. And yes, if you haven't sent us your data yet, please do. We would really appreciate that. So next week, we'll wrap up the course by talking more about what you can do with OpenTrails data. We'll answer any questions that you've had during the conversion process over this past week, and please feel free at any time to hop into Slack and type your questions in. It's possible that someone else who's taking the course also has the same question as you and might want to know the answer. So, and then we can also respond to you during the week in between now and next Wednesday, once we're going through your data and we're all going through the conversion process together. But we'll also answer them next week on the webinar. Next week we'll talk about some of the cool projects that people have built around OpenTrails. Trail Editor we mentioned is one of them, but there are also a bunch of other ones, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll also touch on data stewardship and how you might make sure your data stays maintained over time, how you can identify data champions, and etc. And then last, we'll briefly cover the future of OpenTrails and how you can stay involved in that process. Now, it's possible we won't be able to pack all of this into next week, and if necessary, we can add an additional week to the course. And that's up to y'all. You know, we want to hear your feedback about the pace and kind of what you think would be good as far as more information. but hopefully we can kind of get it all done next week. But really, whatever is going to work for y'all, this class is about you, so we want to make sure that you're served well by it. And in case you forgot who we are, I'm Lizzie. I'm the course facilitator, and you can get at me, Lizzie at trailheadlabs.com, or on Twitter at Lizzie Diamond. Ryan Bransford is the CEO of Trailhead Labs, and you're chatting with him in Slack right now. And you can get at him, Ryan at trailheadlabs.com, or Ryan Bransford on Twitter. Jeremy Monteau is the CTO of Trailhead Labs. He's Jeremy at trailheadlabs.com, or Jeremy Monteau on Twitter. And then Alan Williams is our trusty rusty OpenTrails spirit guide, and he's Alan W at codeforamerica.org, and Twitter handle is most of his name, Alan Joseph Will, which is really fun to say, Alan. I appreciate that. So at this point, that's sort of a nice general overview of the conversion process and what we're going to cover next week, and I am happy to answer any questions. Also, Jeremy, Alan, and Ryan, feel free to jump on and answer questions as well that people may have. So one question that I just got sent was, will Trailhead Labs be able to send us a sample data set to look at some point? It would be cool to see a shapefile of sample trails with everything optimal and ready to go. And that was from Matt and Marin. I believe, yes, that is true. Yes, there is a sample data set that we can send out, and when we send you your data assessment, we will gladly send that out as well. And Ryan, Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that we definitely have that to contribute.
Yep, that's right, Lizzie. We'll be providing some stuff like that as we can, as well as perhaps some other tools for sort of data structuring. So we're more than happy to do that.
Awesome. And yeah, if there's any, oh, here's some more. Burn with the Ridge Trail is saying, maybe not pertinent, but without Google trekking actual trailheads and connectors to the Ridge Trail, we are not serving our users well. So I add non-Ridge Trail sections to the routes I trek when they are crucial to getting to our trail, and presume that in the future I should track those data even if not primary Ridge Trail. And that's actually really interesting because it kind of serves the original use case that Alan and his team were working on last year in Summit County, Ohio. They had multiple stewards and agencies that were managing a trail network that was interconnected, but each group and each agency was managing that data separately, when really a lot of trail networks are interconnected, and that's one of the real values of the OpenTrails specification, is that it allows for easier data sharing and collaboration across agencies. And I think one of the things that we're going to encourage as the course sort of wraps up coming weeks is that is for you to talk to your neighboring agencies and the other groups that are geographically close to you, because it's very likely that your trail data and their trail data actually could connect with each other, and you can start to build these like regional trail network resources for trail goers. So that's pretty cool, and I think that including those trails is probably good. But if you can talk to the agencies that are close to you, that would be helpful. Matt and Marin asks, should we attempt to convert our trails between this week and next as homework? And the answer is yes. We are going to send you an email with sort of an assessment of your data, and that will include some questions that we have about the data that we need to answer before giving suggestions, as well as suggestions of maybe things that you need to add to your data sets, your shape files before converting, and whatever you may need to convert, as well as links to step-by-step instructions for how to prepare your data for conversion. And our hope is that by next week, everyone will have at least attempted to convert data, and please send us your questions, comments, concerns. We are here to help. Well, we are in Slack all the time, mostly, so if you have any questions, you can pop into Slack and ask them, or email us for technical support or theoretical support or moral support. We're here for you to do that. But you'll receive sort of specific instructions and our recommendations and assessment of your data before we ask you to convert. Jeremy, Ryan, and Alan, was there anything that I covered that you feel like needs more explanation, or anything that you want to add to kind of the conversion process?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think you did a great job of covering it all, and we're excited to sort of work with folks over the next week to sort of actually do the conversion. So I don't think I have anything to add now, but one thing to keep in mind is that this ecosystem of sort of tooling around the OpenTrails standard is constantly developing, and as we learn about the way people store their data and work with their data, we'll be keeping that ecosystem up to date and adding to it. So this is not a one-time only thing. This is an ongoing, evolving community.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. You know, we want to know throughout the conversion process what is working for you, what isn't working. Are there the specification is at version 1.1 right now, and it is frozen for a year, but in the future the specification can change if it needs to better serve park and trail agencies. You know, you are our target. So if there's something that you notice or think about that you want to see included in the specification that isn't, please let us know, and we'll record that information and, you know, kind of bring you in as part of the conversation as the specification evolves. And like this is like being a part of a kind of fledgling nubile community is really cool. We are on the ground floor of a movement ultimately, getting people outside, getting people doing exciting work with data and building cool tools. And if you now that like people are excited about it, and especially, you know, developers in the civic technology space are excited, so people are building applications and people are building tools that can be used with OpenTrails data to make some really cool stuff. So if you can and you want to, and you know, what we're encouraging through this process, right, is to actually convert the data and start playing with those things and building cool stuff for your website and mobile applications, stuff that you can send around to other agencies, stuff that maybe you can send to your city's big sports team rival parks department and say, like, hey guys, we made a really cool website for our parks and trails data. What have you been up to lately? Kind of stuff, if you're into that sort of thing. But this is the exciting time where we actually get to be a part of the ground floor of a movement, and that's really exciting. If there aren't any other questions at this point, I think it's just about noon here on the West Coast, so we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for everyone's contributions on Slack and for sending your data along. Please feel free to reach out at any point, Slack or email or Twitter or smoke signal, and we will get back to you, and look out for that email this week about your data and what is left in terms of converting. to OpenTrails. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.